January 17th, 1943, Tunisia. The desert wind carried the scent of burned oil and scorched metal. A Wehrmacht Hauptmann stood in the shadow of a captured American tank, its olive-drab hull still warm from recent combat. The morning sun had not yet reached its full intensity, but already the metal surface radiated heat like a living thing. He placed his palm against the armor plate, feeling the American steel beneath his fingertips. Smooth, uniform, untouched by the irregularities that plagued German manufacturing in the third year of war. Around him, his technical assessment team prepared their instruments, their faces bearing the focused intensity of men who understood they were documenting something that would travel up the chain of command to the highest levels of the Wehrmacht, perhaps even to the Führer himself. The tank was an M4 Sherman, designation medium tank M4, captured intact during the American defeat at Kasserine Pass just weeks earlier. It sat there like a metallic monument to a new kind of warfare. Not the refined, theoretically superior engineering of German design, but something else entirely. Something the Hauptmann had not expected when he received his orders to conduct a comprehensive technical evaluation. He had anticipated examining a crude machine, hastily assembled by a nation that had only entered the war 14 months prior, a country of jazz musicians and Hollywood actors playing at being warriors. What he found instead would shake the foundations of his understanding. The German military machine had, by early 1943, accumulated a vast expertise in armored warfare. From the Panzerwehren's first tentative rumbles across Poland to the Tigerwehren's fearsome debut at Leningrad, German tank design had followed a philosophy of technical sophistication and tactical superiority. Each model represented an evolution in armor science, in ballistic mathematics, in the precise calibration of force and protection. German engineers labored over every millimeter of armor slope, every degree of gun elevation, every revolution per minute of engine performance. The result was tanks that were, in isolated specifications, often superior to their opponents. The Panzer IV had proven itself across 2 continents. The new Tiger struck terror into Soviet tank crews. German doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, the supremacy of the well-trained crew in the perfectly engineered machine. But the Hauptmann, whose name survives in the Wehrmacht archives as Hauptmann Becker, though some records list him as Hauptmann Werner, had begun to notice something troubling in the reports filtering back from the Eastern Front, from North Africa, from every theater where German armor met its enemies. The numbers did not align with the doctrine. For every German tank that rolled off the production line, the Soviets were producing 5, 10, 15 T-34s. The reports spoke of American ships arriving in Murmansk with tanks, trucks, ammunition in quantities that seemed to defy economic logic. And now here, in Tunisia, the Americans had arrived with their own tanks, their own doctrine, their own approach to armored warfare. Becker climbed onto the Sherman's hull, his boots finding purchase on the welded surface. The craftsmanship was immediately apparent, not in the sense of artisanal perfection, but in the uniformity of industrial precision. Every weld looked identical to every other weld. The armor plates fit together with machine-perfect alignment. There were no hand-filed adjustments, no individual variations that spoke of craftsmen making minute corrections. This was not a tank built by skilled metalworkers in a factory. This was a tank built by a factory itself, as if the entire production facility functioned as a single enormous machine, stamping out identical units like a printing press producing newspapers. He had expected to find evidence of American industrial naivety, the mistakes of a nation learning warfare. Instead, he found something far more unsettling, evidence of a philosophical approach to war that had never occurred to German military planners. The hatch opened smoothly, too smoothly. German hatches were precisely engineered but required specific knowledge to operate efficiently. This hatch seemed designed for any man to open quickly, under stress, perhaps even wounded. Inside, the crew compartment revealed its secrets under his examination. The interior was spacious. A German tank crew existed in cramped efficiency, every centimeter allocated according to strict functional necessity. Here, the Americans had built room to move, room to operate, room to breathe. The driver's position offered visibility that would have been considered luxurious in a Panzer IV. The instruments were clear, labeled in simple English, arranged with an intuitive logic that suggested industrial psychology rather than military tradition. A man could learn to operate this machine not through months of technical training, but through days of practical instruction. The transmission was automatic, a feature that made Becker pause and reread his notes to confirm what he was seeing. German tankers trained extensively on the complex manual transmissions that required skill and experience to operate under combat conditions. The Americans had simply eliminated that requirement. The 75 mm main gun occupied the turret with a mechanical simplicity that bordered on elegant. Its traverse mechanism operated smoothly, powered by hydraulics that responded to the gentlest touch. A German gunner trained to hand-crank his turret, to calculate mechanical delays, to compensate for the physical effort of manual operation. Here, a gunner could acquire and track targets with minimal physical exertion, preserving energy and attention for the actual task of combat. The stabilization system, crude by theoretical standards, nonetheless allowed for firing while moving, a capability that German doctrine considered secondary to the superiority of a well-positioned, stationary shot. But the Americans, it seemed, had designed a tank that assumed movement, that incorporated mobility into its fundamental combat philosophy. Becker discovered ammunition stored in wet stowage compartments, surrounded by water jackets designed to prevent catastrophic detonation if the tank was penetrated. German tanks carried their ammunition in accordance with geometric efficiency, maximizing load while minimizing volume. The Americans had sacrificed some efficiency for crew survival, an engineering choice that spoke to a different calculation of value. How much was an American crew worth? Enough to dedicate precious internal volume to water storage, enough to add weight and complexity to the design, enough to reduce ammunition capacity in favor of survivability. The engine compartment revealed the Continental R975 radial aircraft engine, a gasoline power plant that generated 400 horsepower. It was not the most powerful engine in its class. German designers could have, and indeed had, created more powerful engines. But this engine had been adapted from aircraft production, meaning it utilized existing manufacturing capacity, existing supply chains, existing technical expertise. The Americans had not designed a tank engine, they had installed an available engine into a tank hull. This approach violated every principle of German engineering philosophy, which held that each component should be purpose-built for optimal performance. Yet the result was a tank that could be produced in vast numbers without creating bottlenecks in specialized engine manufacturing. He spent 3 days with the Sherman, measuring, testing, documenting. His team disassembled the transmission, examined the armor metallurgy, calculated the ballistic protection coefficients. They test-fired the main gun, measured its accuracy, evaluated its penetration capacity. They drove the tank across the desert terrain, evaluating its cross-country performance, its reliability, its ease of operation. And with each hour of examination, Becker's assessment evolved from technical analysis into something approaching revelation. On the evening of the 3rd day, he sat in his command tent composing his report by lantern light. Around him, the North African darkness pressed close, punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery and the closer sounds of the encampment settling into night. He had filled page after page with specifications, measurements, technical observations. But now, as he reached the conclusion section, he found himself writing something that transcended mere technical assessment. The report began with specifications. Armor: 51mm frontal, 38mm side, adequate but not exceptional. Main armament: 75mm wrist M3 gun, effective against current German medium tanks but vulnerable to the latest Panthers and Tigers. Speed: 38 km per hour on roads, respectable but not superior. Weight: 30 tons, medium classification, comparable to German equivalents. Crew: 5 men, standard configuration. These numbers told a story, but not the story that mattered. What mattered was the production rate. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans were building thousands of these tanks. Not hundreds, thousands. The Fisher Body plant in Michigan had converted from automobile production to tank production and was now producing more tanks in a month than some German factories produced in a year. The Chrysler tank arsenal, purpose-built for Sherman production, operated around the clock with 3 shifts of workers. The Americans had not designed the best tank. They had designed a tank that their industrial capacity could produce in overwhelming numbers. What mattered was the training time. A German panzer crew required months of training to operate their vehicle effectively. The complexity of German systems demanded extensive technical education, mechanical aptitude, careful instruction in the subtle arts of armored warfare. The Sherman could be operated by men with minimal technical background, crews trained in weeks rather than months. The Americans were not producing superior tankers. They were producing adequate tankers in quantities that made superiority irrelevant. What mattered was the logistics. The Sherman ran on gasoline, available from the vast American petroleum industry. Its parts were standardized, interchangeable between units, manufacturable by the same factories that produced automobiles. Its maintenance requirements were documented in clear technical manuals written for mechanics rather than engineers. When a Sherman broke down, and every tank broke down, it could be repaired by men with basic mechanical training using parts that arrived in steady supply from factories across the Atlantic. German tanks, by contrast, often required specialized tools, custom-fabricated parts, expert technicians to maintain their sophisticated systems. What mattered was the philosophy. The Germans had built tanks as weapons of war, refined instruments of military doctrine, tools for skilled warriors to wield in pursuit of tactical excellence. The Americans had built tanks as industrial products, components in a vast logistical system, equipment for ordinary men to operate in pursuit of strategic objectives. It was the difference between a Swiss watch and an American assembly line, between craftsmanship and mass production, between theoretical superiority and practical sufficiency. Becker wrote, "The M4 Sherman represents not merely a different approach to tank design, but a different approach to warfare itself. Its individual technical specifications do not match the best capabilities of German medium tanks. Yet this comparison misses the essential point. The Americans have designed a tank that their industrial system can produce in quantities that render our qualitative advantages potentially meaningless. One Tiger may be worth 5 Shermans in direct combat, but if the Americans can produce 20 Shermans for every Tiger, the mathematics of attrition become unfavorable." He paused, considering whether to include his next observation. Military reports were supposed to maintain analytical distance, to avoid speculation that strayed into political or strategic domains beyond the immediate technical scope. But what he had observed demanded acknowledgement, even if it meant exceeding the bounds of conventional military assessment. He continued, "More concerning than the tank itself is what it represents about American industrial capacity and military philosophy. This is a nation that has converted its peacetime economy into a war production system of unprecedented scale. They do not seek to build superior weapons, They seek to build sufficient weapons in numbers that guarantee victory through material overwhelming. This approach suggests a form of warfare against which our traditional tactical and technical advantages may prove insufficient. The words sat on the page like an accusation, like a heresy against the fundamental doctrines of German military supremacy. But they were true. He had seen the evidence welded into every plate of American steel, stamped into every standardized component, embodied in every design choice that prioritized production over perfection. The report traveled up the chain of command through January and February of 1943. It reached headquarters in Tunisia, was forwarded to Rome, was transmitted to Berlin. Other reports arrived alongside it: technical assessments of captured American equipment, intelligence summaries of American production capacity, strategic analyses of the Allied buildup in England and North Africa. Together, they painted a picture that contradicted the official narrative of inevitable German victory, of military supremacy rooted in technical and tactical excellence. Some officers read Becker's report with understanding, recognizing in his technical assessment the outline of a strategic disaster unfolding in slow motion. Others dismissed it as defeatism, as the pessimistic conclusions of a field officer overwhelmed by temporary setbacks. The optimists pointed to the Tiger, to the Panther, to the new generation of German heavy tanks that would restore technical superiority. They argued that quality would ultimately triumph over quantity, that German tactical excellence would compensate for any material disadvantages, that the sophisticated training and combat experience of Wehrmacht crews made them superior to hastily trained American recruits. But the mathematics were inexorable. By the end of 1943, American factories had produced over 21,000 Sherman tanks. German production of all tank types in the same period reached approximately 12,000 vehicles. The Americans were outbuilding the Germans while simultaneously supplying the Soviet Union, equipping British forces, and maintaining reserve stocks for future operations. And the Sherman was only one component of American industrial production. For every tank, there were trucks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, to transport supplies, move infantry, tow artillery. There were ships to carry the war material across the oceans, aircraft to dominate the skies, artillery pieces to pulverize defensive positions, small arms to equip millions of soldiers. Becker had discovered what many German officers would eventually come to understand. They were not fighting the American military. They were fighting the American economy. Every Sherman represented the industrial capacity to produce not just one tank, but hundreds, thousands, an endless stream of adequate equipment flowing from factories that operated beyond the reach of German bombers, beyond the disruption of submarine warfare, beyond the degradation that years of war had inflicted on European industrial capacity. The symbolic weight of the Sherman came to rest not in its technical specifications, but in what those specifications represented. The automatic transmission was not merely a mechanical convenience. It was evidence of a nation with the industrial sophistication to mass-produce complex components that German factories could barely contemplate. The standardized parts were not merely practical design choices. They were the product of an industrial standardization system that had been refined through decades of peacetime manufacturing. The spacious interior was not merely comfort, it was the luxury of a nation that could afford to dedicate extra steel, extra volume, extra weight to crew survivability because its production capacity made such expenditures strategically viable. German tankers who faced Shermans in combat often won individual engagements. A Panzer IV with an experienced crew, a Tiger with proper support, a Panther in a defensive position, these could and did destroy multiple Shermans before being knocked out themselves. But for every German tank lost, replacement became increasingly difficult. For every Sherman destroyed, another arrived from the ports, fresh from American factories, crewed by new men who had trained on identical equipment, supported by the vast logistical network that sustained Allied operations. The winter of 1943 turned to spring, and spring to summer. Tunisia fell, Sicily fell, Italy became a grinding campaign of attrition. In the east, the Wehrmacht's summer offensive at Kursk, the last great German attack, broke against Soviet defenses supported by thousands of tanks, many supplied by American production. The tide of war, which had turned at Stalingrad and El Alamein, now flowed inexorably against Germany, driven not by superior tactics or battlefield brilliance, but by the crushing weight of industrial output. Becker's report, filed away in Wehrmacht archives, became one of thousands of documents chronicling the gradual recognition of inevitable defeat. Other officers wrote similar assessments, reaching similar conclusions through different observations. Truth assembled itself piece by piece, tank by tank, ship by ship, aircraft by aircraft. Germany had entered a war of industrial production against nations whose combined manufacturing capacity exceeded their own by factors that made victory mathematically impossible. The Sherman itself evolved through the war years, improved and modified based on combat experience. Later versions mounted more powerful guns, heavier armor, more sophisticated systems. But the fundamental design philosophy remained constant. Build a tank that the industrial system can produce in overwhelming numbers, that ordinary crews can operate effectively, that logistical networks can maintain in the field. Build not the best tank, but the tank that wins wars. By May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, American factories had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. German production of all tank types throughout the entire war had reached approximately 54,000 vehicles, fewer total tanks than the Americans had produced of a single model. The numerical advantage was compounded by the fact that American tanks operated as part of a fully mechanized combined arms force, supported by artillery, infantry, and air power, all supplied by the same industrial system that had made the Sherman possible. The Hauptmann's report had predicted this outcome, though perhaps not in explicit terms. He had recognized in the Sherman's design the outline of a different kind of warfare, one in which industrial capacity became the ultimate strategic weapon, in which adequacy multiplied by massive scale defeated excellence constrained by limited production. He had touched the smooth American steel and felt beneath his fingertips the power of an economy that could convert automobile factories into tank arsenals, that could train farm boys to operate sophisticated machines, that could project military power across two oceans while maintaining civilian living standards that remained the envy of the world. In the years after the war, military historians would debate the Sherman's place in the pantheon of armored vehicles. Critics pointed to its thin armor, its tendency to burn when penetrated, its inferior main gun compared to late-war German tanks. Defenders emphasized its reliability, its ease of production, its adequacy for the missions it actually performed. But these debates missed the essential truth that Becker had recognized in the Tunisian desert. The Sherman was not designed to be the best tank. It was designed to be the tank that won the war. The report itself survived in fragmentary form, portions preserved in captured German military archives, sections referenced in post-war technical studies. The full document, if it ever existed as a complete manuscript, was lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse, but its essential observations were independently confirmed by dozens of similar assessments, by the accumulated evidence of German officers who recognized too late what they were facing, by the inexorable arithmetic of industrial production that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. In the cold logic of military history, the Sherman represented democracy's answer to dictatorship's challenge. Not superior men wielding superior weapons through superior doctrine, but ordinary men wielding adequate weapons through sufficient doctrine, multiplied by industrial capacity that made sufficiency decisive. It was the tank equivalent of the American system itself, imperfect, pragmatic, sometimes crude, but backed by resources that made its imperfections strategically irrelevant. The desert wind still blows across Tunisia, across the battlefields where Becker conducted his assessment. The tank itself, that specific Sherman that he examined in January 1943, either survived the war and ended in a museum or scrapyard, or was destroyed in subsequent combat and now rests beneath North African sand. But the truth it represented, the truth that Becker documented in his report, endures. That wars are won not merely by tactical excellence or technical superiority, but by the sustained application of industrial resources, by the capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting, by the economic strength that enables nations to translate peacetime productivity into wartime material. The Hauptmann stood in the shadow of captured American steel and saw the future of warfare. He saw assembly lines replacing craftsmen, mass production defeating precision engineering, adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities rendering superior equipment in limited numbers strategically obsolete. He saw democracy's industrial might arrayed against dictatorship's military prowess, and he recognized which force would ultimately prevail. His report, technical and restrained in its language, was nonetheless a document of revelation, the moment when a professional soldier confronted evidence that contradicted every assumption of his military education and forced himself to acknowledge the implications. The Sherman was ordinary steel shaped by industrial processes, crewed by ordinary men trained in ordinary time frames, supplied by ordinary logistics operating at extraordinary scale. It was the mechanical embodiment of democratic warfare, not the exceptional few accomplishing the impossible, but the capable many accomplishing the necessary. And in that ordinariness, multiplied across thousands of production lines, tens of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of crew members, lay the power that broke the Wehrmacht, that liberated Europe, that confirmed through blood and steel and industrial output that democracies, when roused to total war, commanded resources that made victory not merely possible, but inevitable. The truth exposed was simple and devastating. Excellence without resources loses to adequacy with abundance. The German military had built a doctrine around the former. The Americans had built an economy around the latter. And when those philosophies met on the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself, the outcome was written not in tactical manuals, but in production statistics, not in the superiority of individual weapons, but in the accumulation of sufficient weapons, not in the skill of warriors, but in the output of factories. Becker's report documented this truth through the technical specifications of a single tank, but the truth itself extended far beyond that one vehicle, encompassing the entire strategic balance of the war, revealing through American steel the power of industrial democracy to mobilize resources that authoritarian efficiency could not match. In examining the Sherman, he had examined the mechanism of Germany's defeat,